So welcome everyone to the USRSE DEI speaker series, that is diversity, equity and inclusion. And my name is Sandra Gesing. I'm from the University of Notre Dame, and I'm the co-chair of the steering committee of the USRSE. And Miranda Mont is hosting this event with me, and Ian Coston. Ian Coston is the chair of the steering committee of USRSE. And and Miranda is moderating with Q&A and everything. So yes, this is our first event. We are really happy and very proud that Cheri had time to speak with us today, and we'll talk about can we change the face of computing. And we have the USRSE who haven't heard about us yet. So we are the US Research Software Engineer Association. And we have working groups, and the Diversity, Equity and Inclusion Working Group is really looking at how can we educate each other about diversity, inclusion, equity. We have bi-weekly meetings, and we are looking at vision and mission. We are happy to hear more from everyone. What would you like to see maybe as events? So this is a speaker series. We're really happy to have every 3 months some speakers. And Cherri is our first one. And we want to have workshops. We look really at different possibilities. So the working group is existing now for a little bit over 3 months. And that makes, we are especially honored to have such a great speaker for today, for the first event. And so
I'm not going to sing, Sandra.
No, I love it. So yeah, Cheri has done work as anthropologist, and she will also talk shortly about that. So it is very interesting. And then she joined us in computing and did really pioneer work in usability for HPC, and she was a past director for ACM and the director of the Northwest Alliance for Computational Research. And with that, I would give it now to Cheri, and I stop sharing.
Great. Then I will just start sharing. And I want to thank you for inviting me to be here. Can you see my screen now? No, not yet.
Not that yet.
Now can you see my screen?
Yes, full screen.
Excellent. It's great to be here. And again, I'm really honored to have been invited to do this. And hopefully we can have a little fun as well as talk about some pretty serious issues. So let me start by giving you a little bit of background. I have to say that even though you won't be able to tell from the way I do presentations, I am really a very shy person around strangers. And it's been very hard for me to move up and, for example, to be president of ACM because it went against the grain. But what it meant is I always wanted to study data and develop strategy and solve problems. And that's what brought me to anthropology in the first place. It gave me a chance to observe and analyze what other people do. I spent 2 years doing field research with the modern Inca Indians in Peru. And then I went on and spent 8 years in Guatemala with the modern Maya Indians. And then I returned to the US for a variety of reasons. But the problem was I had no prospects because at the time I did, there were no jobs in anthropology. And I decided I needed to do a reset. So what did I really enjoy doing? It was data analysis and problem solving. So somebody said to me casually, oh, you should be an engineer. And the first thing I want to remind all of us of is that hearing just a few words can change the course of the rest of our life. So we shouldn't think that just because we're not out there giving presentations or talking to large groups of people that we can't change lives. Each of us has that potential. When I enrolled in engineering, I very quickly learned to hide my social science background. I found that engineers of all types, but computer scientists also, think that social sciences are suspect. Now, I have these little things that come up in purple. Those are comments people have actually said to me. And I will tell you, it really hit me hard when an engineer said, anthropology, that's just a bunch of illogical hocus pocus. So the truth is, I hid my background. It was after I got my PhD in computer engineering and I started having grad students of my own that my interest in studying cultures actually got reawakened. I had a graduate student who wanted to develop a debugger for parallel programs. And those, of course, are usually written by computational scientists, not computer scientists. So I said, well, what do we know about how they think about computers and develop code? And it turned out nobody knew. Nobody had ever asked them how they thought about it. The people who wrote tools were computer scientists, and they assumed everybody thought about computing the way they did. So I decided to circle back and change my research to studying what it is that computational scientists and engineers need, and what it is that we as computer engineers and computer scientists can do to meet those needs. It turned out to be a great career choice for a lot of reasons, one of them being that I know what it's like to be an outsider, which is really what these computational scientists feel when they're coming to the technical arena to do their work. First, as an anthropologist, I was the first Anglo woman many of the Indians I worked with had ever seen, but also I had to learn how to communicate through a non-native language. They didn't speak English, I didn't speak Kaqchikel or Quechua, and so we had to communicate through Spanish. And that actually helped in a lot of ways in terms of making me a lot more careful about the way I use language. Then again, when I changed to computer engineering, I was an outsider. I was the first woman grad student. I later became the first woman on the faculty. For many years, I was the only woman in the room at many meetings, some of them 100 or 150 people. Now, at the same time, I had this advantage that I wasn't that much of an other because I'm white. I come from a middle class Christian background. So I'm not like, it's not like if I were a Guatemalan Indian coming into the room with typical techies. So this brings up a question of what makes something a culture and what makes some people be other people. Well, Wikipedia says it real clearly. At the core of any culture, we have shared knowledge and traditions, we have shared language, and we have shared capabilities and habits. Collectively, these things give each culture what is called in anthropology a shared worldview. It's something that manifests itself all the time in our social behavior, norms, arts, laws, and customs. The tech world can be viewed as a culture because it has a distinctive worldview, and it's quite different from the others, even the science world. So let's first of all say this isn't really about my career, this talk. I was lucky when I moved into techie culture because I wasn't totally alien, and I had enough shared culture that I quickly learned how to adapt to their worldview. This is a classic example of what we call cultural assimilation. It always happens when one culture has the power base, whether they got it by conquest, whether they get it from financial or political power, or just because they vastly outnumber the others. But members of the non-dominant culture are viewed as inferior, and many times this is totally subconscious. This is a cultural attitude, not necessarily a conscious thought. So to become accepted, the people from these other groups have to learn how to assimilate, which means they change the way they do things to align with the dominant culture's worldview. Now, what's wrong with this? Basically, I say it's not sustainable, because right now, what's wrong with the tech world and its worldview is the kind of things that others like me, like many of you in the audience, maybe, have to do to survive in tech. Why more people who are others aren't drawn to tech as a career. And basically, this is slowly strangling our field. So what I'm going to try to convince you of is that what we really need in tech is cultural evolution. And secondly, that each of us has a role in making that happen and can do things to make that happen. So what tech culture in general acknowledges is that our worldview, our culture, is overwhelmingly dominated by white and some Asian men. It's generally recognized as a problem because so many tech jobs went unfilled last year, and the Bureau of Labor Statistics says there are going to be 4 million additional computing-related jobs by 2028. So the big question is, who's going to fill those jobs? The changing demographics around the world mean that non-white, non-males are a growing majority of the world workforce that's accessible to the tech companies and to tech educational institutions. And it's now critical to attract more of these others to the tech workforce. So it's not that tech culture has totally ignored this. Typically, the way they respond is to say it's a pipeline problem. We're not getting enough of these others to enter computing in the first place. Well, in a way, that's an excuse. And we'll get to that, why I say that in a minute. But because that's the explanation, the way they usually try to improve things is to hire others who can serve as role models, and to broaden the pipeline through changes in middle and high school. That's good. These are good things. Add diversity incentives, whether it's internships or co-hires or scholarships. All of these things are good things, but have they worked to change the demographics of the tech community? And the answer is no. Many of the others in tech industry leave the field prematurely, and that includes some of the highest ranking ones who leave. In general, we find in universities, at least, students coming up the ranks are more diverse, but in CS, they're not. The levels rose for a few years, but then they dropped back down to what are really disturbingly low levels. And faculty diversity is also disturbingly low, particularly if you look at senior levels. So why hasn't it worked to focus on diversity? Because tech culture's bad reputation, and it does have a bad reputation, isn't just a matter of numbers. In the earliest days, there were more women than men, but they got pushed out through the evolution of the culture. And I say it's because diversity is the wrong target. What that focuses on is demographic makeup. How many faculty or how many employees or how many students are others? But simply hiring and attracting them isn't enough. Now, places are recognizing it, so recently they've shifted to include retention as well, but that's still a demographic perspective. It's still emphasizing the number of others who are at a company or institution. And what we need to focus on is the cultural problem. The demographics are a symptom. The real problem is cultural. The tech culture is a chilly environment for anyone who is different. Someone who looks differently, speaks, behaves, or thinks differently. At best, they're ignored and excluded. Sometimes they're subjected to ridicule or microaggressions. At worst, they are subjected to outright hostility or harassment. So what happens is that of the few others who do come into tech, Those who stay have had to totally assimilate so they can fit in, and many end up leaving, including those who have achieved clout and seniority. And what that does is discourage those who are farther down in the pipeline. So this is a bad situation. It's also bad because assimilation is not great. Assimilation causes cultural inbreeding. There are tons of examples from cultural history over tens of thousands of years that if you have a pattern where you've got dominance and assimilation, alternate viewpoints are gradually weeded out because with the majority dominating it and others joining them, everyone approaches problems in ways that are too similar and they don't even realize it. When the worldview is too uniform, innovation is stifled. And that's critical for the tech industry. The potential uses for new tech may go unrecognized, and we certainly have been seeing in terms of AI and machine learning applications that the solutions don't reflect a full spectrum of users and society. So tech culture needs to evolve away from a culture of assimilation and become one that is more inclusive. Studies, a number of them in the last 10 or 15 years, have shown that in tech, when diverse perspectives are heard and valued, more innovation occurs. And the added bonus is that more of the others are attracted, so demographics improve too. So the reality of cultural change is that our field is at a critical point. Technology itself is evolving really rapidly, but the problem is that we risk strangulation of the tech culture if it can't also evolve culturally. Now, one problem is that unfortunately, cultural change in general is slow. It can easily take decades or even centuries. If you think about things like civil rights or women's rights, that's a problem. Another is that the path to cultural change isn't obvious. It tends to be incremental, tiny changes that build on one another. It's always indirect. It'll lead off in one direction and eventually wander back and zigzag around, and it's based on trial and error. So failures are inevitable. Those are just the reality of any cultural change. What I'd like to do is pose the question here to you of, can cultural change be expedited? Because we don't want to have to wait a century to solve the problem in the tech culture. Whole books have been written about this, and a lot of times they talk about tipping points where a new concept or practice suddenly gains momentum and speed. What ends up setting off tipping points are the actions of individual people. And in general, we refer to them in terms of anthropology as agents of change. They often go unrecognized. You may never know the names of any of these people unless they invented something famous, but their influence on society can be truly profound. And what I hope is that each of you, whatever your background, will aspire to being an agent of change for tech culture. And I'd like to talk to you about how that can happen. We'll talk about it in terms of how cultural change happens, and I'd like to give you 6 pointers for how each of us can be an agent of change. So pointer 1, change does not just happen. It takes work. Agents of change need to proactively create the opportunities to influence others. You can't just sit back and wait for opportunity to come knocking. So what does it mean for me if I want to be an agent of change? My first step is to prove that I am proactive and a good worker. People will need to see me do things, not just talk about them. So how can you demonstrate the value you add? The first thing is to get your foot in the door. One thing is to pick target groups where you could influence people you don't already work with. These may be task forces or conferences or associations outside of your place of employment or within your place of employment, but they're not in your department. They're not the people you're already working with. Then let people know you're interested. If you already know the group, be the first to volunteer for the jobs that it's hard to fill. They're always looking for volunteers for those. If it's a group you'd like to know, search out a contact, ask some questions, get someone to recommend you. The point is to establish your credibility. We never walk into any new group with instant credibility. We have to acquire qualifications and we have to do homework. We have to find ways to make ourselves valuable, and we need to be the one to do more in order to demonstrate that we have that credibility. Once we're seen as someone who gets things done, all kinds of new opportunities become available. We get invited to be on other groups. We get invited to do things that are more important because we've established our basic credibility. So the next pointer is that change of any kind can be frightening or even downright offensive to people. Agents of change need to understand how to make change more palatable. This means I'll need to learn how, because personally, I don't know anybody who I think was a natural agent of change, even though they later became them. It requires learning and effort. And one way to do that, and this is what I suggest you do, is to make the most of every meeting you attend. That's what I do. And making the most isn't necessarily that I'm going to say the most. It's that I'm going to get something out of it that makes me a better agent of change. Because the reality is that people need to be persuaded to change. Their brain is full. You can't just pour more ideas in. You have to understand what their life already has, and you have to figure out how to fit yours in. And you do this by honing your powers of observation. So I make it a goal to learn something new from every person. And I do that by observing how people react to ideas from this person or from that person. What made the difference? Was this person more eloquent? Did this one have a better rationale? Was this one more self-confident? I take notes about those things, and then I spend time afterward thinking about it to figure out when it was that people changed their opinions in the meeting and why. What made an argument persuasive? What prompted people to compromise? And the other thing along with this is to learn when to speak up. Because if we're silent and something else comes up, people assume we agree, or people assume we think the same way they do, or unfortunately, sometimes they assume we just plain don't have anything useful to add. So find a way that you're never totally silent during a meeting. Come up with something that's substantive, even if it's just to say, I think so-and-so's idea was really great because. The third pointer is that change has to be incremental. And to do that, an agent of change needs to understand how to break change down into really small incremental steps. Even if people do agree with my goals starting out, major change typically seems too risky or too overwhelming, too hard to do, too something. And so if I want to achieve this dream, I've got to start small and build gradually. It's not easy to make change happen, but let's talk about how you can strategize how to make it happen. So assume you've already got some concept for making a conference or a project or anything more inclusive. All too often, a great concept ends up foundering because the champion, that's you, can't come up with a really sound strategy for how to make it happen. Successful strategies are always realistic and they're always incremental. And this is one of my favorite quotes is big problems are most often solved by a sequence of small solutions, sometimes over weeks, sometimes over decades. And so we have to learn to think realistically about the time frame and about the number of steps that need to happen. So the first step in this is to plan. You need to spend a lot of time doing homework and come up with specific objectives that are really doable. It's time to forget about the pie in the sky and focus on small steps that lead us toward that long-term goal. People tell me a lot of times, well, that was just a baby step. Well, I will tell you, baby steps are better than making no step at all, and baby steps add up to progress. So figure out a feasible way to implement this doable specific objective you came out. And I always believe in starting with a small scale pilot or phase. First of all, it's easier to implement at a small scale, but it's a lot easier to sell. People will let you do things as a pilot that they would never agree that you could try if you were trying to make it something more major, because they don't feel threatened by pilots. Maybe they're assuming you're going to fail, but they're not feeling threatened by it. And it also allows you to test your concept and improve your strategy as you go. When you come up with your pilot, be realistic about what kind of money you might need or expertise or other resources and where you can realistically get them. You can't just go out and say, I want $100,000 to start this new program. Nobody's going to give it to you. You have to figure out a realistic way to cut down the cost, bring in experts who will donate their time, bring in resources that are donated. And one of the things I learned sort of the hard way is always include ways to prove the plan is working as you go along. So what that means is you can't just say, I'll do this by the end of 12 months. You need to have some milestones for yourself that happen at 4 months and at 8 months where you can go back to people and say, see, so far we're on track. We've been able to accomplish this. Now, once you have that plan, the next thing you have to do is prepare. And that means you need to figure out who needs to approve your plan or be on board. In this case, what's important is, and I'm going to use another anthropological term again, but I think it's easy to follow, you need to socialize your concept. How are you going to sell your idea to each of the people that needs to be on board? What is likely to pique their interest about the concept? And the answer may be different from one person to another. Another question to ask yourself is, do they have expertise or experience that could actually help me improve what I'm doing? As I talk with each target, I pay real close attention to their reactions. That's why I'm doing it one-on-one so that I can see how they're reacting. What resonated with them? What gave them the gleam in the eye? What caused them to jump in and want to say something? What bothered them? Do they have suggestions? And then I use it to refine my pitch for the next time. That is the way you get a really good strategy, is you incrementally develop it through practice. The last step in strategizing is to persist, and you really have to be prepared to do that because everything takes change, takes time. Every change takes time, and it takes a good attitude about it. So keep your eye on the prize. Don't keep telling people, we want to change the world, but you keep your eye and your mind on the prize. Remember, have some humility. You may think your plan is foolproof, but if others don't, they're probably right. I have learned that too, the hard way. What's really important is to accomplish change, not necessarily to do it my way. And just getting people to think about my concept, I need to be able to take as a win because it is a first initial step. Cultural change isn't about what one person thinks is right, no matter how smart or how influential that one person is. There have to be a lot of people, and first they have to recognize there's a problem. Then they have to pay lip service to it. A lot of people get annoyed at the lip service stage, and I agree, it's frustrating that the heads of all the departments are saying this needs to be addressed, but they're not willing to let me try to do it. Lip service is frustrating, but it's an important step, a preliminary step. Only after everybody pays lip service will they actually step up to do something about it. Don't just walk away. Don't just give up. You may need to back off and think of a new way to do it, but keep going. Because my fourth pointer is that change can be painful. Agents of change need to be able to accept that any major change involves setbacks or downright failures. If I don't fail regularly, then I'm either refusing to admit it and learn from my mistakes, or I'm not reaching high enough. Bottom line is, I shouldn't waste good mistakes. I can always learn something from it. And what I say is, and I'll make new and improved mistakes next time. That's the way you can turn failures into wins. Because what looks like failure, if you're thinking of the big perspective of change, what looks like failure is actually a time when I need to make a course correction. It doesn't mean my time and effort spent so far has been wasted, but it does mean that going more down this same path would be wasted. So it's time to sit back and think, why didn't it work? Was this the wrong group to try it with? Did I use the wrong approach for them? Was it the wrong time? Was it the wrong concept? What can I learn from this? And a lot of times what I learn from it is one of these things that I could maybe have gotten more buy-in from others before trying it. Should I have gotten more expertise on board? Recognize that I didn't have all the necessary expertise that would make it a sellable idea. Did I not plan the structure and the steps well enough? Was I so sure my idea was good and my plan was good that I neglected to figure out where failure could occur and provide myself with fallback positions? Hard thinking about failure lets me learn not just how to go farther with this concept, but how to make all my future efforts more successful. What will I do differently next time? In the case of this strategy that I've got that I'm trying to implement, it's time to make a decision. Should I fall back? Should I figure out where things went wrong and fall back to before that and try something new? This time, hopefully foreseeing where some of the points of failure are and what new fallback positions I could have. Do I need to reassess my plan? Do I need to just find a totally different strategy? And timing is important, and it's not necessarily something I can control. So let's be realistic. Should I be putting this on the back burner for now, and I'll try it again in another year or two when the environment around me may be a little different? I have to tell you, I've had quite a few instances where I was just too far ahead of things in my timing, and that when I backed off and let it go for a year or 18 months and did it again, I was able to do it because in that meantime, more people were talking about there being a problem and more people were paying lip service that something needed to be done and nobody had an idea how to do it. The fifth pointer I've got today is that lasting change requires real buy-in. Anybody who is going to be an agent of change needs to recognize that most of the time and effort is going to be spent socializing concepts in advance. I need to be ready to invest lots of time upfront, talking to people one-on-one or in very small groups. The dynamics are so different one-on-one or in small groups, particularly if you get people out of their office. Right now, COVID is making it a little difficult, but I take people to coffee or I take them to lunch where we're on neutral turf, and it totally changes the dynamics of what's going on. Same thing with a group of 2 people or 3 people instead of 5 or 6. And the bottom line is that the bigger the change that I'm trying to do, the more people I'm going to need to get on board first. So how do I get buy-in? How do I socialize something? First, I have to determine who the influencers are in the group. And out of any group, there's always going to be at least one influencer, and there are probably no more than 2 or 3 unless it's a big group. And the key is figuring out who are the people that other people either listen to or pay most attention to. If you can get them on your side, the rest of your job is going to be a lot easier. Then apply what you've learned about group thinking from those earlier pointers about paying attention in meetings, and use what you've learned to develop a persuasive case. Keep it short and try it out ahead of time, one-on-one with each influencer. I always start with the one I think is most likely to buy in. And based on how they react, I adjust my case iteratively to get it more and more tuned to what a larger group of people are going to want. Bottom line is, it's not a done deal until we get the bigger group to buy in. So sooner or later, you're going to have to get a bigger group on board. I suggest that what I try to do, and it's worked pretty well, is to begin with a group discussion of why change is desirable without trying to promote my own way of doing it, but just why we need to change. And then listen as they're doing it. You notice I use the word listen a lot because in anthropology, that's what you do. You listen to how other people think and you learn from that. So listen and try to weave what they commented into the solution. That turns it into a win-win for everyone. For example, if Joe, after I said the first thing, if Joe says, you know, it would be really cool if we could try it out with this group. And then a few minutes later, Mary says, you know, maybe it'd be better if what we had was a survey first. Then try to say, you know, I heard Mary say maybe we should do a survey first, but how about if we combine that with Joe's idea and we do it with a small group and then we do a survey of those people afterwards to find out. This makes everybody think first of all, that their opinion is valued, but secondly, that they're getting their way, and so they're more likely to approve it. The last pointer is the one that I'm going to spend the most time on now, and that is that change starts with my actions. Agents of change don't just recognize that something needs to change. They push themselves to do something about it. I shouldn't just, and I'm going to tell you that a big part of this is the attitude that I have, changing my attitude as well as my actions. I should not assume that people are deliberately ignoring me or pushing me away. People typically are just unaware of what they're doing and the impact that it has. It's really hard, particularly when you go into a meeting with a group you've been with before and they didn't like what you had to say the last time. It's really hard to make sure you don't go in there ready to hear they're being negative. You need to be able to start with a blank slate and say, the past is the past. I should assume maybe they had a bad day. Maybe they were feeling overburdened. Maybe they just didn't understand what I was trying to say, but not they were trying to push me out. When incidents do happen of somebody saying something inappropriate or getting aggressive about it or seemingly deliberately misunderstanding you, turn those things into teaching moments. Use them to help your colleagues learn. And this applies whether you're trying to go in with a plan or whether you're just a member on a project team or whether you're just a reviewer who's a member of a program committee. The people around you don't realize that they are limited by their cultural perspective. We all are. The difference is that hopefully you and I are aware that we're limited by it, and we're trying to think how to get around those limitations. People need help in order to move from being unaware to being an advocate or an ally. So view these incidents as a moment to help jog them out of their culturally learned pattern. To help them learn, do it with nudges rather than shoves. The worst thing you can do is take an in-your-face attitude when somebody else is getting aggressive with you or is being obnoxious. Doing it, if you act aggressively, it makes them very likely to be defensive, come up with a counteroffensive, or to just withdraw from you, depending on what their individual reactions are. So instead of shoving your opinion on them, use a polite question or remark said carefully to draw attention to how those words or that action can be misinterpreted without passing judgment. This is the hard part. In anthropology, you spend a lot of your training time learning how to observe without judgment. And I realize you haven't had those classes, but you can learn it. I know you can, because other techies I know have done this and have done it more effectively even than I. Nudges work best when we're speaking up for others, not ourselves. So if you're the one who's insulted, sometimes it's better just to suck it up. But if you're seeing Allie, who's sitting next to you, being insulted, then you're the one who can speak up. Doing this, it's less personal when you're speaking up for others. So it will be taken as less threatening, and it won't be dismissed as, oh, Allie's just being defensive, because you're not the one who was the target of the behavior. So let's talk about, how do you help colleagues learn what's inappropriate? Remember that it can be very hard for people to recognize. Even people who think they're very liberal and very inclusive may use a term that ends up being derogatory, or they may enact those microaggressions. They probably have no idea that they're being culturally insensitive. I mean, I try to be very careful, and sometimes I find out I really stepped in it with the way I said something. It's not fair to assume that those other peoples are malicious or that they're ganging up on me, but rather I need to assume they probably have no idea they're being insensitive. So what are examples of the nudges I can do? One is, if somebody has answered and said, you can't say that to me, you can say, gee, I don't think he's being oversensitive because he doesn't like to be called that. You're not saying you're wrong for saying it. You're saying, he's not necessarily being overly sensitive, which is what people, somebody who uses a term and is called on it often says, oh, they're just being too sensitive. So you, as the third party, can nudge them with something like this. Or you can say, you weren't implying that's why Ali got his job, were you? What did you really mean to say? Notice that with this approach, you're letting them know what was wrong with what they said, but you're also saying you can't possibly think they have bad judgment. You know they're a good person. What did they really mean? You can say, would you comment about a man's appearance that way? Just curious. This one, I have to say, I've used probably in an even calmer way than that sounded when I read it to you just now, because men don't think about the fact that they're commenting about others, typically women, but it could be LGBTQ community, in ways that might be offensive to that community. And so, reminding them, maybe you should only say to them what you would be saying about a man might be a good way to do it. The fail all one, if you can't think of anything else, just have it on the tip of your tongue. Wow, that was awkward. And that usually catches their attention that they did something. So how are you going to help them learn to value new perspectives? Again, even people who view themselves as liberal and inclusive may ignore contributions that are being made by others who are soft-spoken. They may assign tasks based on stereotypes. They probably have no idea when they're making things chilly like this. So here are some other examples of nudges. I think Edgar's idea was good too, and I like the twist you put on it. When somebody else appropriated Edgar's idea. Believe me, I see that all the time, and I use this one. People always, the person who appropriated the idea isn't that way, thinks they're being acknowledged for thanking them, and they're not getting the credit for doing it. It keeps them from getting the credit. It reminds them that it was really Edgar's idea. And it's a good way of reminding other people that Edgar has good ideas, and sometimes we don't recognize them for what they're worth. Or say, what makes you say that? I thought there were a lot of advantages to the change he was suggesting. Again, you're asking them to do things, but to do things that are completely reasonable. Are you asking Claire to take notes because she's the only assistant professor here? That doesn't seem fair. Fairness is something that if it's called out to people, a lot of people, they know they want to be fair. Do we not want a Black speaker, or is it just that those weren't the first names we thought of? Again, they're not going to say we don't want a Black speaker, or most groups certainly aren't, but they will admit that they just weren't the first names. And then you can volunteer to say, I'll go out and get some names of good people. And finally, help colleagues learn to be proactive allies. How can they support their colleagues who are different? You can show them how. You be the one to say how good one of those other people's idea is and why. You be the one to tell the boss when an other helped you see things differently. You be the one to offer to find names of good speakers who are others. I'll tell you, there's a bonus from doing this, because when your nudge to that one person is witnessed by other people, they're potentially learning by example. They're learning how maybe I can sometimes come across as offensive, or what even I could do to help bring in new perspectives, how I should respond if I see something like this in the future. So don't miss those opportunities to really help your colleagues learn what makes a real ally. I hope that these pointers have shown that each of us can step up to a greater or lesser extent to be an agent of change. We may just do little teeny things, but there's still things that can help change the tech culture. What's really needed to inspire change is to be proactive about seeking our own opportunities to influence others, to be observant about how people react to new ideas, whether they're reacting positively or negatively, patient enough to make small incremental steps. We need to be realistic about facing up to failures and learning them, milking them for all they're worth. We need to be willing to learn how to go about socializing ideas effectively. And we need to be persistent in nudging people to be more inclusive. The real bonus is that all of these things are leadership qualities. So getting good at them, exercising them actually improves our own careers, as well as helping inspire change in our environment. And now this, I'd like to talk for a minute a little more specifically to the people in the audience who specifically are others, whether you're a woman or a person of color or a single parent who is different from everybody else in your office place or your department. If things are going to change, our otherness is actually really needed. That's the thing to remember. We don't think the way our mainstream colleagues do. We approach problems differently and we see different ways to solve them. And we know it's time for tech culture to make some real changes. We've also assimilated, otherwise we wouldn't have the jobs we have. And in doing that, we honed some key skills for agents of change. We know how to be patient, even if we don't like to be. We know how to be persistent. We can plan, but still be flexible. We have the strength to overcome obstacles. And we have learned to understand the importance of compromise. Now, there's a downside to our having assimilated and learned all these things, because by assimilating, we have actually become part of the problem. Some of our actions might be perceived, think about how they might be perceived by other people. If all of us take the more, let's take the example that some of our colleagues are very aggressive about getting their points across. So in assimilating, we've learned how to be more aggressive in getting our points across. But is that saying that the existing tech culture of aggressiveness is okay? Are we reinforcing the expectations of our colleagues that people who are others are the ones who need to adapt, and that the people in the majority do not need to adapt or change? We need, as others, to commit to becoming part of the solution. We need to help find the fixes and help solve the problem. So I'll point out that many organizations are very actively trying to change the tech culture for particular groups. You know that you've got a new group in RSE, and they're working on it. Working through these other ones can help us become more effective. A lot of times they have good pointers, or they've had experiences that can help us learn how to plan our pilots in a little better way. I'll tell you what I personally have experienced primarily through ACM, although I've worked with a couple of those different groups over the years. When I work through an organization that's trying to affect that technological culture, I'm part of a community of outstanding peers. It really, from a selfish standpoint, it gives me unique opportunities to expand my own network. And it can be really helpful when I want to float ideas or need advice. If I hadn't gotten really engaged with the HPC community, I would never have met the people from National Labs that I work with, and they have really given me some great ideas. Even though they're at a research lab, they're not in an academic institution, they still have a different twist on it, and they've seen other things that work. With an organization, there's also a multiplier effect for my efforts. Group projects are always much richer than I could possibly do as a single person, and my impact can reach a larger audience, even a global audience, if you're working with a global organization, as I have been doing. I've been able to grow as an individual and as a leader. I keep learning more and more about what affects my opinions and how I can influence others. And it keeps opening up new opportunities for different types of leadership experiences, just like your kind invitation to come and talk to you today. This is an opportunity that would never have opened up for me if I hadn't started working more actively through ACM. We, all of us, whether you're an other or whether you're part of the majority group, we can make a difference. We can't go back and change what has happened, but we can change what happens from here on out. We need to stop blaming the dominant culture for problems we see. We need to accept that everybody, including us, has culturally learned perspectives and that we are blinded by these. And that we can't expect other people to just naturally, intuitively see how to approach problems differently, or how to think about things differently, or even how to discuss these issues. People honestly don't know and don't see what they're missing, and that applies to each one of us. What we don't know, we don't know. So let's make a difference. Let's all sort of agree that we can do little things to help our colleagues realize that just having others around the table is not enough, that we really need to value what perspectives and backgrounds other types of people bring. Each of us can manage to be an agent of time, one agent of change, one baby step at a time, one nudge at a time. And my last slide, I'm going to give you a plug for one of my favorite resources that I'm not affiliated with, but I use them all the time. BetterAllies.com has a free weekly newsletter, and it's all about everyday actions that we can take to create more inclusive workplaces. It's really worth taking a look at what they do. I will stop sharing my screen. I'll give you just a minute to write that, and then we're ready to take some questions.
Thank you so much, Cheri. That was fantastic. We have gotten some questions as we went along. I'm going to start, I think, at one of the older ones, because at least a couple of people had a similar trend in terms of this question. So it looks like agents of change will necessarily have to be resilient. Wouldn't that require the prospective agents of change to come from privileged groups and thereby be less aware of the challenges faced by minoritized groups?
Actually, I agree. You have to be resilient. But to tell you the truth, a lot of the best agents of change I know come from minority groups. And I think part of the reason is that they have had to learn to be resilient in a much harder school than I have. You know, if you're really from a smaller group, you haven't had a single thing easy along the way. And so I think actually, I understand that it's much harder for you to do anything and accomplish anything, but in doing so, you really fine-tune these skills that an agent of change really needs.
Great, thank you. Another question that came up asks for a little bit more details about the pointers. So do you have some basic pointed pointers on how to get more expertise involved in your plans?
Okay, and Miranda, why don't you leave your face up too, so I'm not the only one, and that'll make it a little easier for doing it. For, I'm sorry, pointers about how to get other people with other expertise involved. Well, part of that is figuring out who you're going to talk to and who you're going to float an idea by. It's, you know, it's part of this business of needing to build a personal and professional network. There are people you can go to and ask for things. I'll give you an example. Through just chance, it was actually her action. I met a woman from the College of Business soon after I came to Oregon State. We never actually worked together on a project, so we weren't colleagues in that sense, and we certainly weren't in the same college or the same department. But just talking to her informally over coffee, over lunch, she had good ideas, and I saw she thought of things differently than I did. You know, she just approached things differently. And so when I want to go and talk to somebody, sometimes when it's expertise out of my field, I'll just go and say, do you have any idea how I could find somebody who knows about this? A lot of times, you know, if you approach people and you ask them for advice or ask them questions, as opposed to trying to sell them something, they're really glad to give you the benefit of their advice. These could be people in your own department where you just get them out of the office and you take them informally to coffee, and you learn that they have 2 kids, and you learn what floats their boat, and you start seeing that maybe they have good ideas about something. And you haven't asked them for anything. In fact, you've bought the coffee. I always buy the coffee or the lunch. It's money well invested. But then when you do want to tap them as a resource, you can call them up and say, Tom, I really need somebody in deep learning who would be a good speaker. And I really want a non-traditional speaker. I want a woman. I want somebody from industry. I want a person of color. And they, you know, they kind of owe you because you bought them that silly cup of coffee.
Great, thank you. I actually have another question along that line that kind of speaks to the same thing. So many of the pointers that you have revolve around the ability to gauge people's reactions, find their on button, and most of that seems to rely on either these face-to-face interactions or these nonverbal cues. But in this new highly virtual meeting world, those cues aren't as readily available. So how do you recommend addressing that difficulty with these virtual meetings that we have so much these days?
That's the thing that worries me about all the virtual meetings that we have, to be honest, because first of all, you don't even realize that in a face-to-face meeting, whether it's one person or 50 people, there's always an energy exchange. You pick up the energy. You can tell when all of a sudden people start getting excited. You can't tell that on the screen where everybody's sort of, you know, staring, some of them not anywhere near the camera, you know, or dark light or something like that. And people almost seem afraid to show physical reactions on camera. What you can do, obviously, is you can watch the chat channels and you have to see if it looks like you can't watch everybody at once if it's a big group, but then narrow your focus down and watch these 4 people for the first 20 minutes and then start watching these people instead, you know, and see what perks them up, if anything, or what makes them make just a little bit of a frown, you know, because they didn't understand it or they did understand it. Yeah, it's a lot harder to read these expressions when you don't have the energy and in the room. And we tend to see micro expressions that are too fine to see through the resolution of a Zoom camera. So we're definitely operating at a disadvantage in the virtual world, but you can't let that stop you. And for example, if you hear people stomping on somebody else's idea, you use chat to say, yeah, Joe, I thought so-and-so's answer was great too. Or why did you say this? Or, you know, I like to raise my hand, but I have to admit often the chair or the moderator doesn't notice that I have my hand raised. So I usually have to either use chat or I do this through the camera, whatever necessary to catch people's attention. It's hard, but you can do it.
That kind of leads into a good segue into another question. So do you have any favorite rituals for combating mission fatigue, like reading particular books or talking to other groups of like-minded people when you're feeling discouraged?
I do both, but I'd say I am most likely to do not necessarily read the kind of books you're thinking about. I have a couple of strategies. One is to escape from it. And I try to clear my mind. I try to leave one day each weekend when I don't do anything work related for this, because I learned a number of years ago that giving myself a chance to just let things will be on the back burner, but not in the front of my brain, and clearing my brain. And that means taking a hike. It could mean getting together with somebody, not quite so much in the age of COVID since I live alone, but or reading a book. I can escape. I can't escape through television or movies to the same extent that I can through a book or a good hike in nature. So one is escape, to give my brain a chance to clear out so that I can approach it with as fresh a perspective as possible. And the other one is to tap into some of these resource people. I mean, I gave you that one example was a woman from the business school, but there's a guy I know who's a civil engineer. He's Japanese, and for some reason he has a great sense of humor. So if I'm feeling really down about something, I can always count on him to find something ironic about the situation, or turn it into a gosh, aren't people crazy kind of moment. And so I use these yeah, I guess that's kind of a rude thing to say, but I use these people for different things. And I think they use me also. I don't think it's an abusive relationship.
That was great. We actually had a second question that was kind of along the same lines. So maybe you might be able to reuse some of the answers before, but maybe help with a little targeting on it. So another person asked, in a moment of realizing that you're treated differently, it feels very sad. We can't always suck it up or just decide to be strong. So what are some strategies for coping with this feeling of sadness?
Okay, so I don't know if this will work for anybody else. I use deferred gratification. So first of all, in the moment, in the meeting, if you just did something, for example, if you gave Ian total credit for something I did and he didn't say anything about it, but I can't really step up and nobody else does, and I have spent a month on it, it is really depressing. I tell myself, I will start thinking about that after 4 o'clock. And I will sort of put it in a box until then. I can't say I won't think about it, but I can convince myself to delay. The other thing I do, oh gosh, you make me tell all these things that make me sound really stupid, but I tell myself, okay, we're going to have a pity party, but our pity party can only last 24 hours or a certain amount of time. And for that time, I can wallow in it. I mean, I can feel awful. I can feel angry. I can do whatever, but my pity party has a hard deadline. And thank you to Charles for saying that it's not stupid if it works.
I will have to say I do the same sort of thing where I allow myself to wallow for some amount of time before I move on as well. All right, I had another question, kind of on a different topic here. So we've spoken quite a bit about the process to follow once there are ideas on the table, but in terms of specific ideas, we've only discussed those that don't work in the long run, like hiring, scholarships, etc. Where do teams learn about ideas that others have tried and that do work well in practice, rather than slowly iterating over their own ideas until they happen to fall upon success?
That's where those other organizations really key in, and where the immediate one you can go to is betterallies.com, because the everyday actions they show or talk about, and they do a newsletter every week. They also have a good Twitter feed if you want to do that. Their things are all based on experience that individuals have done and that have been successful. And so quite a few of the things I've learned about or tried have ended up coming from that. Or I steal ideas all over the place. I think imitation is the highest form of flattery. So, I mean, I'm always on the lookout for good ideas. In fact, one of those nudges that I was talking about, where you say, wow, that was awkward, I got from a tweet by Better Allies a couple of years ago. So, and I've used it very effectively. So, you know, just be open to things. There are organizations that are doing this and are making these ideas very available to people. And if you don't necessarily like Better Allies, you can go, maybe you could post on your website that slide or that list of organizations as a starting point, so that everybody can see it. Yeah, I don't want to be typing it in right now.
That's great. Thank you. I think that's a great suggestion. On that kind of note, though, you said the one of the things that you like to use, the, oh, well, that was awkward. It can be difficult to overcome this feeling of discomfort when attempting to help show another person why their words may have been inappropriate, especially for those who are already seen, even partially, as an other. So how do you help yourself get over this fear of discomfort?
That's why I say do it for somebody else. I would do it if somebody did that for Miranda. I would not do it if somebody said it to me. You know, I have a very hard time, even today, even after all this experience I've had, standing up for myself, you know, but I have no problem standing up for somebody else when I see them being subjected to something that I know would hurt me or would make me feel really excluded. So start by doing it for other people. And sooner or later, I've gotten to the point where there are a few of those things that I will do for myself. I will now say, oh, I'm really glad you liked my idea, and I like what you did with it and that added tweak you did. Something, I will do a couple of things like that, but I won't tell them when they said something that hurt my feelings. I will go after, Miranda, I'm there for you, so you let me know if anybody does it to you.
That actually leads really nicely into a question that Nicole Brewer just posted, which is, it seems that being palatable and maintaining cultural diversity are always at odds. How do you separate or balance these ideas without falling into a double standard?
I'm not sure exactly what you're meaning by palatable.
I'm going to interpret, but Nicole,
Okay.
please feel free to clarify if I am interpreting incorrectly. If particularly, I think what she might mean is if you're seen as an insider, that means that you've assimilated, so you shouldn't be calling people out. And when you do, that makes you less seen as an insider or less approved, basically, by the rest of the group, because now you're pushing back on the assimilated culture. And Nicole, if I am wrong, let me know.
So here's where, you know, you need to distinguish what you're doing with your peers versus subordinates versus superordinates. So with my peers, once I'm accepted, for example, once I got tenure, I could start saying things I could not say when I was untenured. You know, I never felt comfortable doing. And so, like I say, that meant I was part of the problem, because some people could interpret it that I was agreeing with what they were saying, but I still wasn't in a position to do anything about it. So you have to look at when you're in a position to do something. even as an untenured faculty member, I could stick up for graduate students and I could stick up for staff members, and I did. Then once I had tenure, I could do some things for untenured people that I couldn't do while I was still at that level. Now, the problem is when you're trying to get change from your boss's level or your boss's boss's level. And I wish I could say that has never been necessary with my bosses, but it sure has been. So it's very hard. I found the two strategies I use. One is, I hope nobody's going to tattle on me to the university, okay? But one thing I do is if there is somebody who is like, so let's just say hypothetically, the problem is with the dean of a college. The dean has some people he or she listens to. Everybody has some people they listen to. And the key is to try to figure out who that is. Who has an influence on that person? And then I try to figure out if I get to know those people, and I try to figure out who seems to be the most reasonable or the one, most likely to be persuadable by what I see as compelling arguments. And I'll go to them. And this actually happened, not with the dean, but at a level higher than the dean, where I had heard, this wasn't even a committee I was on, but I had heard of some things that had been said by this higher up at committee meetings that were really not things that he said, but were said in his presence at meetings he was running. So I contacted the person I knew who interacted a lot with him and that I knew he respected their advice. And I said, I don't know, there is this great thing that I have learned, and I usually blame Better Allies for it, whether or not it's true. I've learned this great thing from Better Allies, and that is it's really up to the person who's running the meeting to call out the behavior as being inappropriate. And the thing is that it's a double win, because not only do you let the person who was disrespected know that you value them and you're not going to let them be disrespected, but because you're the leader, everybody's listening to you, you are setting an example of what all the other people should do when they see similar occurrences happening. This is this teaching moment, learn by example kind of thing. And that has worked. I have to say that has worked because they never thought about, this particular leader had never thought about the fact that by not saying anything, he was condoning behavior. And that by saying something, he could live up to what were part of his words in policy, that we value lots of different perspectives. It was, again, where there was lip service, but the actions didn't match up to it. But I didn't feel I could approach him directly, and so I approached him indirectly.
That was a fantastic answer. Thank you. That kind of leads me though into a question I actually had jotted down while you were giving your presentation was, let's say that I'm new to an organization. Most of your pointers seem to revolve around being able to gather this intel about the people on their team or the people in your organization or who has the ear of the dean, for example, like you just said. But if I'm brand new in this organization or very low in the pipeline, how can I be an agent of change? What can I do considering that I don't have very much clout?
Well, the first thing to do is build your network of influence. And that's where it's going to be much harder to do virtually. So I'm going to discuss when you're in a more normal work environment where there are opportunities for face-to-face first, even if it's only once a month when you're visiting the home office. And that is, never underestimate the value of coffee breaks or lunches. I never waste a lunch. When I am on campus in normal times and not traveling, I always am having lunch with somebody because it's an informal time and you lead off, you get to know them as a person. And it's much harder for somebody to diss you or to leave you out once they know you as a person. Much harder. There's also the fact that if you go, and I don't just go knock on the door and say, you want to have coffee with me, the low life who has just hired on. I say, I wonder if I could buy you a cup of coffee because I have a couple of questions I'd like to float by with you since I'm new here. And I always have a couple of questions already that are like openers. I try to leave them open-ended for them to go and do things that are based on their experience. So it'll be like, based on your experience, what do you think is the single thing you wish you had done when you were still an assistant prof that would have made it easier to get tenure? Or what do you wish you had done to make your first project run more smoothly? Whatever. People love to have you approach them as somebody who has some wisdom and some advice to give. And I followed the advice. Everything I've learned, just about, I've learned from the advice of other people. And I just can't overstate how welcome it is to get their advice, but at the same time, you're building this personal relationship, which means you can later tap them for ideas, you can tap them to be an ally. I rarely go into a meeting without having discussed at least one or two of the agenda items with a couple of people ahead of time, so the ones I care about. I'll say, what do you think of this proposal we're going to be talking about, or something to sort of get at least one ally ahead of time. That's that business of socializing ideas and socializing your actions ahead of time.
That was great. Thank you. We had a couple of questions that either came from the earlier or about some of the statistics that fell throughout the presentation. So one of them was the statistics that were mentioned earlier in the presentation about tech industry, mostly being white and Asian males. Is this global or is this specifically in the US?
It's global if you're looking at majority. If you're looking at overwhelming majority, it's more North America and Europe. Well, India has a slight, what I'm saying is India will skew things because there are so many people, so that they have what is not a lot more women, but more than we do, for example, in the US. And because there are so many people, it sort of it's hard to know how you're measuring, but it is definitely a global problem that people who are not part of the dominant culture, which is everywhere is male. Obviously, white male is primarily in North America and Europe, but in India, it's Indian males. In China, it's Asian males. It's those things. And the point is that the dominant culture excludes a lot of other people.
Cherri, a short interruption only. So we have 4 minutes left. I would be happy to go over. Do you have more time? Can you stay on? Because we still have a couple of questions. If not, we fully understand. And
No, I can stay on a few more minutes, sure.
Oh, great. Thank you. And the other thing, there was, so the recording will be online, and people would like maybe that you share the slides. If you send them to us, we could publish them on the website. Would you?
Yes, so we'll see what we do. Yeah, let's email back and forth after.
Oh yeah, that's true. We have to, we email about that. Okay, so I give it back to Miranda. Thank you.
Thanks. And then another question that kind of it was a statistic bent was, where would you find the best statistics about women's participation in computing careers and their participation in computing and data sciences as students and professors in higher education? Do you have any recommendations?
Well, for higher education, that one's pretty straightforward because two groups, the Computing Research Association and ACM, do a very detailed survey every year called the Talby survey. It's published in Communications of the ACM, but it's also available on the web. That's TAULBEE. And they've been doing it for years and years, and they look at the makeup of faculty at different levels. They look at salary. They look at student cohorts. So they do a very complete job. Now, if you're not talking about four-year colleges and universities, there's another group that is doing it in two-year schools, and I think you can find it by going to the ACM website under the Education Board, because they're the ones who run it with this other organization that's specifically of community colleges and four-year teaching institutions. They also do it. Now, in industry, there are a couple of groups that do it. Anita Borg Institute would be a good place to start, because although they don't tend to do it themselves, they tend to have links on their website to the things that are done. There are a number of groups that are looking at women in tech, and I'm trying to think who else I can tell you that I know has survey, because part of it is whether it's anecdotal information or whether it's, large scale survey information. NC WIT, of course, the National Center for Women in Technology. They're probably even better than Anita Borg for finding this information.
Great,
They focus more on industry rather than academia.
Great. So we're gonna backtrack a little bit, because we got a question after the fact. So we mentioned before, or you had mentioned before, that you never waste a lunch. You're always making sure that you're using your lunchtime effectively. So in these virtual times where lunch opportunities are hard to come by, how do you go about doing that? How do you make the most out of your interactions with people?
So, and a lot of this is going to be affected by sort of your own demographics and what your cohorts are. Some people are really comfortable doing one-on-one Zooms or three-way Zooms. And so I'll use those with people, and I'll say, let's have a virtual coffee break, or something like that. Other people I have found just aren't that happy about Zoom. And so I adjust to them. So I'll suggest for those people, let's do a telecon. I know how to do it on my phone. I'll call you, then I'll add in the next person in a conference call, or I'll Skype you both, or whatever, to phone numbers. They don't even have to have Skype. I try to make it really easy for them, and I try to be flexible about the mechanism. And then I also think about who they are, whether they already know each other, or whether we're doing three-way, but I know each of them well and they don't know each other. And that will tailor sort of how I get things going, and whether or not. I have one friend who just loves to always have an opening question. Let's talk about this issue today. I don't like to be quite that structured. I do things in different ways, but I'll usually have in mind one or two trial balloons I can float and see if they're interested in talking about them or not. Because depending on what's going on in their life, they may want to talk about some pressing problem they have, or whatever's really on their mind.
Those are some great tips. We've got one question left, and it's more of a comment, but maybe you can provide some tips. I'm the only woman in the directory board of our association in bioinformatics. I keep trying to reinforce the importance of bringing diversity to our events, but most of the time I feel that I'm being totally ignored in this quest. I may change the way that I approach this. Do you have any tips perhaps on how she could approach it?
One of the things is, and I actually learned this from somebody from Los Alamos National Lab back in the late 80s. I was on a program committee for the big high performance computing conference. And believe me, there were precious few women at the conference and precious few ever in the program. And this woman said to me, Cheri, you're getting to the point in your career where it's up to you to step up and make the difference. You should set as your personal mission that anytime people are talking about we're having a panel or we'd like an invited speaker on something, you name 2 different women whose credentials will stand up to it when they go on the web and look. You put in the homework time to find them. If you just tell people we need to have women, nobody ever knows who to invite. You know, I mean, the names that occur to people are the ones they see over and over again, and they hear over and over again. Where's the diversity in that? So we need to be the ones to do some background checking, and it takes time. You have to do some research on the web. You don't want to name people who only have, it's because they have a photo, it's a woman of color or a man from the Middle East. You know, you want it to be somebody whose credentials will be accepted by others, but then people are usually very willing to consider them. That's what I found anyway. They don't know how to go about finding those people, and they don't particularly want to invest a lot of effort into it.
Thank you so much, Cheri. That was the last of our questions. So what I'll do is hand it back over to Sandra to close us out.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, Cheri, thank you again for this wonderful talk. Thank you to everyone with all the questions. I think the discussion was fantastic. Thank you, Miranda, for leading all the structuring the questions, and Ian, of course, for hosting the webinar. Yes, sir, kind of stuff. And and yeah, hope to see you all maybe at the USRC community call or in the DEI working group. So you can find it on the website. We are happy about feedback. Join us on the Slack channel. We will provide the recording on the website. And I think this is it for today, and thank you all for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.